The land was dry, cracked like broken porcelain beneath the endless sky. Wind whispered through brittle grass, carrying with it the scent of dust, old sorrow and something ancient no one spoke of anymore. Clara Whitmore adjusted her straw hat and wiped the sweat from her brow. She had been up since before the sun, wrestling with a broken fence post and praying the last of the well water would stretch until morning. There wasn't much left, not of the water, not of her money, and not of her will, but the ranch was all she had now. Her husband had died the previous winter, taken suddenly by a fever that no doctor could name and no preacher could soothe. The town of Ashridge had buried him quickly and forgotten him even quicker, and they'd looked at Hannah with those same tired eyes they gave to women who didn't know their place, too young to be alone, too stubborn to remarry. She lived, a mile out, past the mesquite trees where only the desperate or the brave kept homes. Most days Hannah wasn't sure which one she was. The wind shifted, a buzzard circled high above, slow and wide. That's when she saw him. At first she thought it was a bundle of blankets left behind by travelers, but as she stepped closer to the ridge behind her barn, her breath caught. A man, lying on his side, chest rising faintly. Blood stained the earth around him, dark and cracked like rust. His long black hair was tangled in dust. He wore no boots, only a deerskin shirt torn open at the shoulder, revealing a wound deep enough to show bone. And then she saw the necklace, beads, and a feather. Apache. Her heart slammed against her ribs. Every story she had heard growing up surged forward. Stories of raids, of burning farms, of children stolen in the night. Warnings whispered in church, pews, curses, spat in saloons. She took a step back, another, but then he moved. Not a lunge, not a threat, just a low, pained groan from his lips as he tried and failed to lift his head. He was dying, and not quickly. Hannah looked around. No one. The road was quiet. The town would not send help. They wouldn't care if a wounded Apache bled into the earth. She should have walked away. She knew that. But instead she turned back toward the barn. Moments later she returned with a dented tin cup filled with well water. Precious, nearly gone, and knelt beside the man who might kill her if he lived. She didn't speak, didn't ask his name. She just lifted his head gently and placed the cup to his lips. At first he didn't drink. His eyes flickered open, dark, unreadable, wild and fixed on hers. Still she waited. Then slowly his lips parted. He drank. It was only a sip, but it was enough. When he finished, she set the cup down and rose to her feet, trembling. For a moment she thought he might grab her hand, or speak, or curse her in a language she didn't understand. Instead he looked at her for a long second. Then he closed his eyes and exhaled, almost in peace. Hannah turned and walked back to the house, unsure if she'd just saved a life, or invited death onto her land. That night she didn't sleep, and before the morning sun could rise above, the canyon hills' thunder rolled across the dirt, not from the sky but from the earth. Dozens of hooves, dozens of warriors, all riding toward her ranch. The sun had barely crested the hills when Hannah heard them. The ground shook before she saw them. Dozens of riders silhouetted against the orange sky, their figures rising like ghosts from the horizon. Horses moved in tight formation, silent but fast. No dust cloud, no shouts, just the steady thump of hooves approaching her ranch like a heartbeat growing louder. She froze on the porch, one hand gripping the old rifle her husband had left behind. It wasn't loaded. She didn't know how to fire it, but it made her feel less naked. The first rider appeared just past the corral, then another, and another. Within moments the ranch was surrounded, warriors on every side, their faces painted in quiet rage, feathers trailing in the wind. No one shouted. No one pointed a weapon, but their presence was a warning. Then she saw him, the wounded man. He rode at the front, sitting upright but pale, the blood still fresh on his sleeve. He dismounted slowly, his eyes never leaving hers. The others waited. Hannah swallowed hard, not daring to speak. He stepped toward her, limping, quiet, a strange dignity to him even as his body leaned with pain. When he stopped just a few feet away, the morning wind caught his hair and revealed his face more clearly. Young, maybe early 30s, but weathered, a scar cut across his jaw. His eyes, sharp and dark, held no anger, only something heavier, something older. He raised one arm and spoke, just a single word. The rest of the riders remained still. Then he turned his gaze to them and added in Apache something she couldn't understand. Whatever he said, it changed everything. Weapons were lowered, eyes softened, a few men nodded. And just like that the warriors began to retreat, some with a glance back, others without a word, all except one. He remained, the wounded man. He walked past her, toward the barn, and without asking sat in the shade near the water trough. He didn't look at her again, just closed his eyes and leaned back against the post, like he had always belonged there. Hannah stood there for what felt like hours. The town would never believe it. They'd say she was cursed, or worse, traitorous. She could already hear the whispers. That widow's gone mad. Took in a savage. They'll slit her throat and burn the place down. But no one had slit her throat, and nothing had burned. She walked toward him, still holding the empty rifle. "You shouldn't be here," she said softly. "They'll come looking. The sheriff. The town." He opened his eyes, said nothing. "I gave you water," she added. "Not shelter. Not this." Still no answer. Only a faint flicker in his gaze, like amusement maybe, or defiance. "Do you understand me?" she asked. His voice, when it came, was low, rough, accented. "You saved. I protect." Hannah blinked. "You protect." He nodded once. "Until you are safe." It was so matter-of-fact, so final. She stared at him, heart thudding. Then she sighed and muttered, "You're as stubborn as every man I've ever met." He almost smiled. Almost. By noon, the ranch was quiet again. The warriors were gone, leaving only hoofprints and dust behind. The man, she didn't even know his name, stayed near the barn, saying little, watching the horizon like a soldier waiting for orders. He didn't ask for food, didn't ask for anything, but he fixed the fence post she had failed to mend, chopped wood for the fire, gathered water from the well, his wound still seeping through the wrap she'd used the night before. Each time she tried to stop him, he said the same thing. "You gave, I return." By evening, Hannah found herself setting 2 plates on the porch table, one for herself, one for him. He nodded when she did, but still, he didn't eat until she had taken the first bite. And that night, when she blew out the lantern, she looked out the window and saw him sitting under the stars, keeping watch, not as a guest, not as a prisoner, but as a shadow of something she couldn't name yet, something that felt safe. 2 nights passed, and in that time, no one came from Ashridge. No one asked about the warriors. No one checked on the widow who'd lived too long alone. The silence was almost more dangerous than the noise, but Hannah felt it in her bones. Something was shifting. Each morning, the Apache man, who still hadn't given his name, rose. Before dawn, he tended the fire, brushed the horses. He limped less now, though the bandage on his shoulder remained tight. She had offered to change it, but he had shaken his head. "No, wound must stay." "Why?" He touched the feathers around his neck so they remember. "Pain teaches." It was the longest sentence he had spoken yet. By now Hannah had stopped, asking him to leave. Something about his presence felt, not just safe, but essential, like the ranch breathed easier with him near. He never entered the house. He never asked why she lived alone. He never touched her. But she began to notice small things. A rabbit cleaned and left near her door. A broken drawer in the barn quietly fixed. Her boots, polished. Things no one had done for her since before Eli died. On the 3rd morning, she went to town for flour and coffee. The moment she stepped through the general store's door, the room hushed. 3 men stood by the ice, window ranchers, hardened and bitter. Their eyes slid to her. "Back from your secret war camp, Hannah," one of them She ignored it, picked up her sack of flour. Another man muttered, "They say you're keeping one of them, out there on your land, feeding him, sleeping with him." The words cut like knives. But she didn't flinch, until the sheriff stepped from behind the counter. Sheriff Granger wasn't a cruel man, but he wasn't brave either. He wiped his glasses and sighed. "Miss Whitmore, we've had reports." "Reports," she repeated flatly. "Or gossip." His jaw tightened. "You know tensions are high. Folks don't take kindly to harboring enemies." "He's not an enemy. He was wounded. I gave him water." One of the ranchers laughed. "That's what you call it now." Maddox raised a hand. "Enough, Hannah. Just be careful. People are nervous." She left without the coffee. That night she sat on the porch, her arms crossed tight, staring into the dusk. The Apache warrior sat on the ground nearby, sharpening a small knife with a stone. He didn't look up, but she felt his attention shift. "They think I'm a traitor," she said. He stopped sharpening. "They think I'm sleeping with you." "Nothing." She looked at him. "You're not going to say anything?" He tilted, his head considering. "Then words are smoke." She almost laughed. "Easy for you to say. You're not the one they'll run out of town." He paused. "You gave water to a dying man. That is not shame. That is root." "Root." He nodded once. "In my people, a woman who gives water gives life. Not just to body, to spirit." You gave what cannot be repaid. A long silence fell between them. Then, faintly, she whispered, "You speak like someone who's lost more than blood." His eyes darkened. He turned back to the blade. She didn't pray. That night, after the lantern was out, Hannah awoke to a noise. Wood breaking. Voices outside. A scream. Cut short. She jumped from bed and ran to the window. 5 men. Lanterns. Guns. They had come while the world slept. They had come for her. One of them kicked the barn door open. Another shouted, "You in there, red lover? Come out." She grabbed the rifle, useless, still, but held it anyway. The front door burst, and then, a shadow moved faster than any man. A blur of bone and blade. A scream. Another. A man fell. Then another. In less than a minute, the yard was silent again. Hannah stood frozen in the doorway, breath hitching in her throat. The Apache man stood near the fence, breathing hard, the knife wet in his hand. 4 men lay moaning on the ground. The 5th ran into the dark. He turned to her. "I stay," he said simply, "until all danger sleeps." And she, shaken, heart pounding, eyes wide, nodded once, because for the first time since Eli died, she didn't want to be alone anymore. By morning, the broken men were gone. Hannah hadn't asked where he took them. She hadn't asked how none of them died despite the blood. But she had seen the way he moved, like a windstorm wrapped in silence, and she suspected death had come close enough to be felt, then spared at the last second. Mercy, perhaps, or a message. Either way, word spread fast. By midday the town buzzed with whispers. Sheriff Granger came riding up with 2 deputies, stopping just short of her fence line. Hannah met him on the porch with a calm she didn't feel, her hands still shaking beneath her shawl. "We heard there was an attack," Maddox said, removing his hat. "You all right?" "I'm alive," she said plainly. He eyed the barn. Was it true? Were they after him? She didn't answer. "Hannah, I can't protect you if you don't. I never asked you to protect me," she snapped. A pause. The wind picked up, stirring the dirt at their feet. One of the deputies spat. "She's hiding a savage. That's what this is." The men were trying to run him off, protect the town. Hannah took a step forward. "They broke into my home in the middle of the night. You call that protection?" Maddox raised a hand to settle the tension, but it was too late. The deputy's glare hardened. "You're putting us all at risk," he muttered. "Them Apache'll turn on you fast." Then from behind the barn a shadow moved. He was there, the warrior, no weapon in hand, no threat, just his silent presence. But it was enough to send the deputies reaching for their holsters. Maddox barked, "Stand down." The air thickened. Time froze. Then slowly the Apache man raised both hands and stepped back, disappearing into the shadows again. Maddox looked at Hannah. "You've got to choose. Hannah, the town or him. You can't have both." She didn't flinch. "I never asked for either." The sheriff left with a heavy heart, but the deputy rode away with fire in his eyes. That evening, Hannah sat by the fire, arms wrapped tight around herself. "You shouldn't have come out," she told him. "You're just giving them more reasons." He stirred the fire with a stick. "They do not need reasons, only excuses." She stared at the flames. "I used to believe this land was home. Now I'm not sure it was ever mine." He looked at her, his face softened by firelight. Home is not a place. It is a choice." "And what if I chose wrong?" she whispered. He was quiet for a long time. Then finally, "Then we fight for it." The next day the church doors slammed shut when she walked in. Mothers pulled their children close. A preacher turned his back. Outside the saloon, men fell silent when she passed. One muttered, "Witch." Another threw a stone. It hit her, shoulder hard enough to bruise. She didn't cry. She didn't stop. That night she returned home and found a handmade object resting on her porch, a small woven charm of straw and feathers. Apache, protection. She looked out into the darkness, and knew he was near, watching. Not because he owed her, but because something had shifted between them. A thread, invisible but strong, had been tied, knotted that day by the well, and with every threat from the town, it only pulled tighter. The wind howled that night like it had something to say. The shutters rattled. The lantern flickered low. Hannah lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the echo of that stone hitting her shoulder still pulsing beneath her skin. They would come again. She could feel it in the bones of the house. Outside the barn stood quiet, cloaked in darkness. The warrior hadn't spoken much since the sheriff's visit. He worked, he watched, but the fire behind his eyes had cooled into something colder. He was waiting for something. So was she. At midnight she heard it. Boots, creaking boards, voices, whispers, low and mean. She sat up. The door to the chicken coop slammed open. Then came the screams. feathers flew, a torch was thrown, flames licked the dry straw like a starving dog. Hannah grabbed the rifle, though she still didn't know how to fire it, and ran barefoot through the doorway. She saw them, 4 men masked, drunk on power. One held a branding iron red with heat, another held rope, and the third, Sutter. Of course it was Sutter. He was the man who owned half the town and wanted the other half. Ever since her husband died, he'd been circling her ranch like a vulture, offering help that always came with strings. "I warned you, Hannah," he called out. "You keep betting savages, you'll lose more than chickens." Before she could reply, the barn doors burst open. Koa, not running, just walking, deliberate, calm, a predator already in motion. Sutter raised his gun, but Koa moved first. A blur, a crunch of bone. The man with the branding iron screamed as the weapon was twisted from his hand and hurled into the dirt. One of the masked men ran. Another tried to fight. He didn't make far. The last man, Sutter, stood his ground, fury burning in his eyes. "You think you can scare me, Redskin?" Koa didn't answer. He stepped forward, blood dripping from his knuckles, and said just one word. "Enough." Sutter sneered. "You're lucky she's here. Otherwise I'd gut you right here." That's when Hannah stepped beside Koa and leveled the rifle, shaking, but aiming straight. "Try it," she said. "See what happens." Sutter's sneer faltered. "You wouldn't shoot me." She didn't blink. "I don't have to. He already spared you once." Koa said nothing, but his silence was thunder. Sutter spat into the dirt and turned. "This isn't over." "You're right," Hannah replied. "It's just beginning." They buried the fire, saved what animals they could. By dawn the yard smelled of ash and burnt feathers. Koa's hands were torn. Hannah wrapped them in cloth, sitting on the porch beside him as the sky turned orange again. She didn't speak. Neither did he, but there was something between them now, thicker than smoke, stronger than silence. Blood on the fence, truth in the soil, and a bond that neither war nor whispers could undo. The days grew hotter. Ashridge fell silent in her direction. No more stones, no more sheriff, only silence. And in many ways that was worse. A town can yell in fear, but when it goes quiet it starts to plan. Hannah tried not to let it get to her. She kept her head down, tended her land, fed the chickens that survived, fixed the coop with hands that had long since learned not to tremble. But her world had changed, and not just because of fear. Koa stayed. He didn't speak much. He didn't ask to stay. He simply acted as if the land belonged to both of them now. And strangely, that assumption no longer frightened her. He repaired the barn roof, sharpened her tools, set traps that caught rabbits without harming them. They didn't talk over meals. He always waited for her to start eating first. He never sat too close, never lingered inside the house, always just close enough to be felt, never close enough to be questioned. And it was in that space, between what he said and what he didn't, that something else began to take root. One night after supper she found him outside, sitting cross-legged by the fire, carving something small from wood. The stars above them blinked like ancient eyes. She sat near him, quiet. "What are you making?" she asked. He didn't look up. "Memory." "For who?" He paused. "You." She blinked. "Why?" He kept carving. "You gave me water. Then you gave me choice." She tilted her head. "What choice?" "To stay." She looked into the flames. "No one else would have. Not in your place." He glanced at her then, just once. "You would." It wasn't a compliment. It was a truth. She smiled faintly. "I used to think kindness was weakness. Eli, my husband, used to say it would get me killed." He didn't ask about Eli. He didn't say sorry. He just waited. And so she continued. "He wasn't cruel, just cold, proper. He thought love was something you owed, not something you showed." Dakota turned the carving in his hand. It was beginning to take the shape of a bird, a hawk, maybe, its wings spread wide. "And you?" he asked softly. She hesitated. "I used to think I had to earn love. That if I worked hard enough, smiled enough, stayed quiet enough, someone might think I was worthy of it." He looked at the carving. "You were always worthy." The words hit her like the first drop of rain after months of drought. She didn't respond, but her eyes burned. The next morning, she found the carving on her windowsill. A hawk, carved, smooth and strong, with a single black bead tied around its neck. She ran her fingers over it slowly, then tucked it into her pocket, close to her heart. That day she baked cornbread, real cornbread, with the last of the good flour, and brought it out to him near the fence line. They ate together under the sun. Still no words, but they didn't need them anymore, because what lived between them now didn't need language. It was built in silence, forged in fire, bound not by promises but by presence. The first time she touched his skin, It wasn't intentional. They were moving a heavy beam from the barn roof, and her hand slipped. His fingers caught her wrist, steadying her before she fell. Calloused, firm, but careful, she looked down at the place where his hand gripped hers, then up at the long scar that ran from the base of his thumb to the bend of his elbow. "How did you get that?" she asked quietly. He released her hand. A pause then. "I was 13. The soldiers came." She didn't move. "They said we had stolen cattle. We hadn't, but they burned our crops anyway, took my older brother, set fire to our lodge." He looked past her, at something far away. "My mother pushed me out the back, told me to run. I didn't want to, but I did." He ran a thumb over the scar. "A blade caught me as I escaped. I bled alone under a cedar tree for 3 days." Hannah swallowed. "What happened to her?" His voice was quieter now. "They killed her, left her body in the ashes." She reached for the beam again, but her hands trembled. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "You didn't do it." "Doesn't mean I'm not sorry." He looked at her then. "That is why I stay." She frowned. "Because I'm sorry?" "No," he said. "Because you remember what others choose to forget." That night it rained, the first real rain in weeks. She stood on the porch and watched the sky open up, soaking the land. The cracked earth drank eagerly. Dust became mud. The roof leaked in 2 places, but she didn't care. She turned to find him behind her, silent. "Do you miss them?" she asked over the sound of thunder. "Your family?" He nodded once. "I miss Eli," she said, "but I also don't." That made him tilt his head. "He kept me in a safe little box. Told me what to wear, what to say, how to act. I think he loved the idea of me more than the woman I really was." Koa looked out at the rain. Then without a word he stepped off the porch and into the storm. She watched him lift his face to the sky, let the water hit him like a blessing. He raised his arms just slightly, barely more than a breath of movement. But something about the gesture felt sacred. She followed. Together they stood in the mud, soaked to the bone, not speaking, not touching, just being. And in that moment the storm didn't feel like chaos. It felt like cleansing, like the past being washed from their skin, drip by drip. Later by the fire he unwrapped the bandage on his shoulder. The wound was nearly closed. She knelt beside him, carefully applying fresh salve she'd made from herbs and beeswax. It was then she saw the other scars. Not just the one from the soldiers, but others, dozens, some old, some deeper than others. One looked like it came from an arrow. She didn't ask about them. Instead she said, "Every scar is a story, isn't it?" He nodded. "And every story leaves a mark." He met her gaze, and "Some marks," he said, "lead us to the people who can carry them with us." She felt her breath catch, because somehow, without ever planning it, she had begun to carry his, and maybe, just maybe, he had started to carry hers too. The storm passed, but it left behind more than puddles and clean air. It left stillness. A strange kind of peace settled over the ranch, one Hannah hadn't known in years. The land smelled different. The wind felt softer. Even the chickens, those that remained, clucked with something like relief. But peace never lasted long in Ashridge. One afternoon, as Hannah was cleaning out an old chest in the loft, one that had belonged to Eli, she found it. A letter, folded in a cracked envelope stained with dust and time. She sat down on the wooden floor, the light slanting through the rafters, and began to read. "To Mr. Sutter, as discussed, I agree to the sale of the property at the offered price. Once my wife is informed, I expect discretion until the paperwork is finalized. She's not ready to let go, but I am. Eli Whitmore." Her hands trembled. The date was 3 weeks before Eli died. He had planned to sell the ranch behind her back. To Sutter, of all people, the same man who now led the charge to drive her out. The same man who had tried to burn her home down. The air turned cold. Around her she read the letter again, then again. Eli had planned everything. He hadn't even intended to tell her. Just take the money and leave her with nothing. She stood up too fast and knocked over the chest. Old tools clattered to the floor. Koa heard the noise and came in through the barn doors, eyes alert. "Hannah," she held up the letter with a shaking hand. "He was going to sell this place. To Sutter." Koa took the page gently, read it once. His face didn't change, but something behind his eyes hardened. "You still have the land," he said. "For now." Her voice cracked. "If Sutter kept a copy, he'll come with papers, with a judge. And her voice broke again. "I thought Eli loved this place. I thought he loved me." Koa folded the letter carefully and placed it on the table. "He loved control," he said. "Not land. Not you." The words weren't cruel, they were freeing. That evening Hannah rode into town alone. She didn't tell Koa. She didn't ask permission. She wore her best dress, the one she hadn't touched since the funeral, and pinned her hair like the woman they used to admire in Ashridge. Let them see her coming. Let them stare. At the courthouse she asked to see Judge Leland. The clerk hesitated. You got business, Ms. Whitmore?" She held out the letter. He read it. Eyes widened. "I see." 10 minutes later the judge met her in his office. A large man with thick spectacles and a dislike for fuss. She laid the letter on his desk. "This was never filed. My husband intended to sell the land, but he died before anything was signed. Now Sutter's trying to claim it, and he's doing it through fear." The judge studied her. "You have proof of intimidation." "I have ashes on my porch and scars on my fence." A long pause. "Then let me look into it." Back at the ranch, Koa was waiting. She handed him the letter. "It's not over," she said, "but I'm not going to run." He nodded once. "Good." Then without warning she stepped closer, placed her hand on his chest, felt the steadiness of his breath beneath her palm, and said, "I don't want to carry this alone anymore." His hand came up slowly, resting over hers, not pulling her closer, just holding. There was no kiss, no declaration, only two people broken by different worlds, sharing a truth too sacred for words. The next morning she woke before dawn. Koa was already saddling the horses. He didn't ask her if she was sure, and she didn't tell him she was scared. They both knew. The air was thick with heat, though the sun had barely risen. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk cried sharp and high. It felt like a warning. They rode side by side, past the broken fence, past the burned coop, past the place where blood had soaked the dirt. Hannah didn't look back. She'd done that too many times already. By the time they reached the town square, people were already gathered. Sutter stood at the center, arms crossed, smug as a fox in a henhouse. His men flanked him, rough and ready. And there, by the courthouse steps, stood Judge Leland. Hannah dismounted and handed her reins to Koa, then marched straight through the crowd, eyes locked on the judge. Sutter laughed. Well, look who's found her nerve." She ignored him. "Judge, you said you'd look into the deed." Leland nodded slowly. "I did." He held up a folder. "Mr. Sutter never filed a purchase contract. There's no legal transfer, and the letter you brought proves intent, not completion." Sutter stepped forward, face darkening. "We had a deal. You had a promise," the judge said sharply, "from a man who's no longer alive. That doesn't mean you own the land." The murmurs began at once. Sutter's voice rose. "She's lying. That paper could have been forged. She's shacked up with an Apache, for God's sake. She'd do anything to keep that ranch." All eyes turned to Koa. He stood still, calm, and yet everyone took one step back, except Sutter. He drew a pistol. It happened fast, too fast for thought, but not too fast for Koa. He moved with the speed of a storm breaking open. One step, two, and then he was between Hannah and the gun. A shot rang out, gasps, screams. The bullet missed, not by accident, because Koa had knocked Sutter's arm sideways with the force of a sledgehammer, sending the pistol flying. Then, without a sound, he pinned Sutter to the ground, one knee on his chest, one hand around his throat. Still no word, still no hate, only pressure, enough to remind, not enough to kill. Leland shouted, "Let him go." Koa looked to Hannah. She nodded. Sutter choked, gasping for breath, humiliated before the whole town, but no one stepped in to help him, not this time. Later, the judge handed her a signed paper. "Your deed," he said. "It's yours now, legally, permanently." Hannah took it with both hands. "Thank you," she whispered. He looked over her shoulder at Koa. "You might consider moving farther out, for safety." She nodded. "We'll consider a lot of things." That night back at the ranch, they didn't speak of the town, or the gun, or the faces that had finally looked at them with something close to respect, or at least wariness. Instead she brought out 2 cups of coffee. They sat under the stars, shoulders nearly touching. "I thought I would lose everything," she said. Koa looked at her. "You found something instead." She turned toward him. "What?" He hesitated. Then, with more courage than she'd ever seen in his eyes, he said, "Someone." Weeks passed. The sky shifted from summer's fire to the golden breath of autumn. The land cooled. The cicadas fell quiet. The earth, once so parched, began to soften under cooler winds. And still he stayed, not as a guest, not as a ghost, but as something in between. Koa never asked for anything. He slept in the barn, even when she offered the spare room. He ate only what she shared. He spoke little, but his presence became part of the ranch, like the hills or the windmill, constant grounding. One evening, as Hannah brought in the laundry, she caught sight of him by the well. He was staring at it, not drinking, just staring. She approached, her skirts brushing the dry grass. What is it? He didn't look up. This is where it began. She nodded. I was ready to die here, he said. And you gave me life. Her voice was soft. I didn't do much. He turned to her. You did everything. A long silence followed. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out something wrapped in cloth. She opened it slowly. A necklace. Beads of bone and turquoise threaded with a single raven feather, and a stone carved into the shape of a wave. It's beautiful, she whispered. What does it mean? He looked at the well. Water is more than survival. To my people, it's spirit, memory, the bond between two lives. She traced the beads with her fingers. And this stone, it means even in silence you are not forgotten. Her breath caught. I made it for you, he said, but only if you choose to. Duty. She looked up into his eyes. Dark, steady, unflinching. I choose, she said. From that day on, things began to change. Slowly, deliberately, the townsfolk still whispered, but some began to wave. An old woman brought eggs from her coop. A child left flowers on the fence. No apologies, no explanations, but kindness, at last began to return. One afternoon, Sheriff Granger stopped by on horseback. He removed his hat and said, I'm not here on business. Just checking in. She offered him coffee. He declined, then added, the council voted. They're not going to press anything. Not now. She nodded. Thank you. He glanced toward the barn, where Koa was mending a wheelbarrow. He ever gonna leave? Hannah looked over her shoulder. Koa didn't notice them. He was focused, hands moving with quiet purpose. She smiled. He doesn't need to leave. He already belongs here. Maddox gave a grunt that could have meant anything, then tipped his hat and rode off. That night, as stars blanketed the sky and the wind played soft through the dry grass, Hannah sat beside the fire with Koa. She leaned her head gently against his shoulder. He didn't move away. She whispered, do you ever miss the life you had before? He was quiet a long time then. Yes, but this is something new. She nodded. And together they listened to the wind, to the water in the well, shifting softly below, to the silence that now felt like home. Sometimes the most powerful acts are the smallest. A cup of water, a place to rest, a word left unspoken, but deeply understood. Hannah's story reminds us that kindness carries risk, but it also carries reward. That love doesn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it arrives in silence, stays through fire, and speaks with actions far louder than words. If this story moved you, tell us in the comments. Have you ever risked something to do what was right? And don't forget to like, share and subscribe for more stories of strength, honor and redemption.